My name is Yusuf Al-Hadia, and I am 40 years old. On March 17, 2024, at precisely 7:14 in the evening, I stood in the formal reception hall of the Al-Hadia ancestral compound, under the blaze of crystal chandeliers imported from Istanbul, surrounded by 73 members of my extended family, and listened as my father, Sheikh Mahmoud Al-Hadia, declared me dead. Not physically dead, not murdered, not executed by the state. No, my father declared me dead to the bloodline, dead to 14 generations of our lineage, dead to every memory and honor attached to the Al-Hadia name. In our world, that kind of death is often more final than the grave. The room was silent when he spoke the sentence. No one dared breathe. My mother lowered her eyes to the floor, as if she were attending a funeral that had come too soon. My brothers stared straight ahead, unmoving. Their wives shifted nervously, hands trembling in their laps. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was a force of nature that filled the room more completely than the ornate patterns on the walls or the scent of burning oud drifting through the vents. When he pronounced that I no longer existed, it was as if every shared memory we had ever built evaporated into the air. My crime, as they called it, was simple to summarize, but impossible for them to comprehend. I had transformed the family guest house, our proudest architectural treasure, a building that had hosted scholars from Al-Azhar, imams from Cairo and Islamabad, diplomats, judges, royal representatives, into an underground church. For 18 months, 47 men and women had gathered inside those walls not to recite Quran, not to debate jurisprudence, not to pay homage to centuries of Islamic scholarship, but to worship Jesus Christ, the Messiah I had met in the darkest night of my soul, the Savior who had found me in the very place my ancestors believed God's favor dwelled. I walked away from that hall with nothing. No inheritance, no identity, no home, no access to the wealth and influence that once defined every part of my existence. But as I stepped out of the compound gates for the last time, with only the clothes on my back and the name of Jesus burning quietly in my chest, I realized something unexpected. What I believed was the end of my life was only the beginning of my true one. I was born into a world where faith and power were woven so tightly together that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The Al-Hadia lineage was not merely a respected family, it was an institution, a living monument to centuries of religious influence. Our name carried a weight that could open doors in ministries, royal courts, and academic circles across the Middle East. People often described us as a dynasty of devotion, though devotion was rarely the true currency. We were shaped more by legacy, expectation, and the relentless pursuit of maintaining an empire of spiritual authority. My earliest memories are filled with images of my father, Sheikh Mahmoud Al-Hadia, standing at the grand pulpit of the central mosque in our province. His voice carried like a storm across the prayer hall, confident and unshakable, echoing against the marble pillars. People traveled from distant cities just to hear him speak. Government officials sought his counsel. Scholars considered him a guardian of orthodox tradition. To the world, he was a man chosen by God to interpret the divine. To me, he was simply father, yet even that felt like a title reserved for someone I rarely knew personally. From the moment I could walk, my future had already been carved in stone. I was the firstborn son, the heir, the continuation of the Al-Hadia legacy. Expectations encircled me like invisible chains. At 5 years old, I was placed under the supervision of private tutors trained in classical Arabic, Quranic recitation, and jurisprudence. At 7, I had memorized the entire Quran, every verse, every surah, every rule of tajweed. It wasn't an achievement born from passion or spiritual hunger, it was survival. It was the only way to be worthy of my father's gaze. At 12, I began leading prayers in smaller halls within our compound, my voice trembling not from fear of God, but from fear of disappointing the adults watching from the sidelines. By 18, I graduated with top honors from one of the kingdom's most prestigious Islamic universities. Professors praised my discipline, scholars admired my intellect. My father, for the first time in years, placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You make me proud." Those 4 words were meant to anchor me. Instead, they became a reminder that my worth existed only in perfection. Our compound itself was a world suspended between opulence and suffocation. It sprawled across several acres, high sand-colored walls, ornate iron gates, manicured gardens lined with date palms, fountains imported from Morocco, and a labyrinth of interconnected buildings. There was the main residence where my parents lived, the adjoining homes for my brothers, the servants' quarters, the private library that housed manuscripts older than entire nations, and finally, the guest house. The guest house stood at the far eastern edge of the compound, like a sentinel guarding our heritage. Built by my grandfather nearly 6 decades earlier, it rose with quiet elegance, 2 stories high, wrapped in latticed windows and carved wooden balconies. Inside, every corner spoke of history and hospitality, intricate carpets hand-woven in Iran, lanterns casting warm golden light, a common room with high ceilings and rows of cushions where scholars debated late into the night. This building wasn't just another structure, it was a symbol of our family's commitment to intellectual discourse, a place where visiting dignitaries and religious leaders found refuge. When my father handed me the keys to the guest house at 32, it was not just a gesture of trust, it was a coronation. The guest house was where reputations were shaped, alliances formed, and interpretations of scripture challenged. I was expected to host with grace, converse with authority, and uphold the standards of hospitality and scholarship that had made the Al-Hadir name immortal. And for 5 years I did exactly that. But beneath the flawless execution of duty, something inside me was quietly eroding. It began as a gentle discomfort, a subtle sense that the rituals I performed so perfectly were hollow echoes. When I stood to lead prayers, my voice recited the words flawlessly, yet my heart felt detached, as though someone else was speaking through me. During Ramadan, while the rest of the family gathered each evening with glowing eyes and joyful anticipation, I felt only a dull emptiness. I longed for something I couldn't name, a connection, a presence, a sense of being truly seen. As the years passed, the emptiness grew. I would walk through the library surrounded by ancient books and wonder why none of them brought me peace. I would watch my father preach and feel a strange distance, as if I was witnessing a performance I was expected to replicate for the rest of my life. Even my marriage to Amina, arranged with meticulous attention to lineage and compatibility, offered no reprieve. She was kind in her own way, dutiful and gentle, but our relationship was shaped more by expectation than love. We lived like 2 actors reading lines for a play neither of us had auditioned for. There were moments when the weight of it all became physically palpable, nights when I couldn't sleep, mornings when I stared into the prayer mat, wondering why my chest felt tight, days when laughter from visiting scholars rang through the guest house and felt like a foreign language I could no longer speak. Everyone believed I was thriving, the perfect successor to my father. But inside, I was unraveling stitch by stitch. Looking back, I think the guest house sensed it before I did. The walls that had heard decades of scholarly arguments, doctrinal debates, and spiritual teachings now witnessed my silent unraveling. I would stand in the dimly lit common room after guests had retired for the night, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and feeling as though the building itself was waiting for me to name the void I carried, waiting for something to shift, and something would shift, just not in any way I had ever imagined. The more my life appeared immaculate from the outside, the more it fractured within. The expectations that had shaped my identity since childhood tightened around me like an iron clasp, leaving less and less room for breath. My father often said that responsibility was the crown worn by those chosen to lead, but what he never mentioned was how heavy that crown became when no one taught you how to carry it without losing yourself. Every day unfolded with a suffocating precision. Sunrise prayers, meetings with scholars, hosting dignitaries, reviewing manuscripts, responding to correspondences on behalf of my father, leading discussions on jurisprudence, delivering lectures, even the moments meant for rest, family dinners, evenings with Amina, walks through the courtyard, felt scripted, as though I were performing a role I had inherited rather than embracing a life I had chosen. I kept telling myself that this was honor, this was purpose, this was what generations of Al-Hadir men had lived and died for. But late at night, when the compound fell silent and the moonlight slipped through the carved wooden screens of my bedroom, a different truth whispered to me, a truth I tried desperately to ignore. I was becoming hollow. There were signs long before I was willing to acknowledge them. My chest tightened during prayers, as though the words I recited were pressing against a wall deep inside me. My mind wandered during lectures, drifting away from the doctrines I had memorized into unanswered questions I wasn't permitted to speak aloud. I found myself avoiding my father's gaze, terrified he might see the cracks spreading beneath my well-polished exterior. Amina noticed something was wrong, though she never confronted me directly. Her glances lingered a little longer, her questions became softer, more tentative. "Are you tired?" she would ask, "or should we take a short trip somewhere?" But travel was impossible. My obligations were constant, and fatigue wasn't the problem. I wasn't tired, I was unraveling. The worst moments came during the gatherings my father hosted for elite scholars. These men used to excite me. Their conversations once felt like intellectual fireworks, passionate, brilliant, energizing, but over time their discussions became noise. I sat among them, nodding, contributing, maintaining the facade, all while feeling a strange and unbearable distance growing inside me. Their voices would blur, as though drifting through water, and I would suddenly become aware of my own heartbeat in my ears, loud, insistent, panicked. Sometimes I caught myself staring at my hands resting on my knees, wondering why they felt so foreign, as if they belonged to a man I was impersonating. What made the burden even heavier was the unwavering respect I received everywhere I went. People greeted me with reverence, calling me Sheikh Yusuf, praising my knowledge, thanking me for guidance I didn't remember giving. Their admiration felt like chains. The more they honored me, the more I feared I was deceiving them, playing the devoted scholar while my soul quietly starved. Have you ever felt that way? Living a life so polished that no one can see you're breaking? Smiling so convincingly that no one notices your heart is slipping into silence? Standing among people who believe you have all the answers while secretly suffocating from questions that have no place in your world? That was my daily existence. A performance so flawless that no one, not even my family, suspected the storm gathering inside me. The pressure didn't come only from my father or society, it came from my own sense of duty. Every time I felt the emptiness, I responded the only way I knew. I tried harder. I prayed longer. I fasted more frequently. I read more commentaries. I buried myself in scholarship as though truth could be excavated through discipline alone. But nothing worked. The more effort I exerted, the louder the silence within me grew. It felt like walking in a desert with a mirage of water shimmering on the horizon. No matter how far I traveled, the water always stayed just out of reach. And worse, I feared that if I ever admitted the truth, everything around me, every bond, every expectation, every illusion, would shatter beyond repair. Still, the collapse did not come in one dramatic moment. It came slowly, quietly, like sand eroding the foundation of a seemingly unshakable structure. Night after night, the guest house became my refuge, the only place where I could be alone with the gnawing ache inside me. I walked its hallways after guests had gone to sleep, listening to the hum of the lights and the soft creak of old wood beneath my feet, feeling as though the building itself was waiting for me to break. And eventually, I did. The collapse came on a night that looked no different from any other. The guest house was quiet, its usual visitors long since retired. The lamps dimmed to a soft amber glow that stretched shadows across the empty common room. I had stayed behind to finish reviewing a handwritten manuscript, but my eyes could no longer focus on the lines. Words that once came easily now swam before me like drifting ink in water. I closed the book and leaned back, pressing my palms against my face. The silence in the room felt heavier than usual, thick enough to feel on my skin. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant rustle of palm leaves outside the window, even the soft thudding of my own heartbeat, too fast, too loud, as though it were trying to escape the confines of my chest. Then the shaking started. At first it was subtle, my hands trembled slightly, something I blamed on exhaustion. But within seconds it spread through my arms, my shoulders, my whole body. I gripped the armrests of the chair, trying to steady myself, but the room began to tilt, the ceiling dipping as though the entire building had lost its balance. I gasped, swallowing air in shallow, desperate gulps that didn't seem to reach my lungs. A pressure tightened around my chest, sharp and paralyzing. My vision blurred, my breath fractured into broken pieces. Panic surged through me like a wave, overwhelming, uncontrollable. It felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating me, trapping me in a life I no longer understood how to carry. I slid from the chair and fell to my knees, my fingers digging into the carpet. The scent of the old wool filled my nostrils, mingling with the metallic taste of fear rising in my throat. Something inside me cracked, not softly, not symbolically, but with the clarity of breaking glass. A soundless shatter, a rupture I could feel deep within my chest. For the first time in my life, I couldn't pray. The words that had shaped my entire existence refused to form. I opened my mouth, but only a strangled whisper escaped, a whisper that felt like it had been buried inside me for decades. God, if you are real, where are you? The question hung in the air, fragile and trembling. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't blasphemy, it was desperation, the cry of a man who had spent his life building a tower of certainty only to watch it collapse in a single night. I stayed there on the floor, trembling, breathless, hollowed out, feeling the weight of everything I had believed crashing down over me. I didn't know it yet, but that moment of complete collapse was the first doorway to the truth that would soon change everything. In the weeks that followed that night of collapse, I moved through my days in a daze, functioning, responding, performing, but no longer present in the life I was living. Something had cracked open inside me, and though I tried to ignore it, the emptiness only widened. I feared that if I stopped moving, even for a moment, I would fall through that emptiness and never find my way back. It was during this fragile period that Dr. Samir Haddad arrived. Samir was unlike any scholar I had ever met. He was soft-spoken, carrying himself with the quiet assurance of someone who did not need to impress anyone. His eyes held a kind of gentle intelligence, a depth that made you feel as though he saw far more than you were saying. He had been invited by my father to consult on a complex matter of comparative jurisprudence, a field in which he was considered a leading authority across the region. From the moment he stepped into the guest house, there was something different about him. Scholars typically walked in with the confidence of ownership. After all, the building was practically a shrine to their world. But Samir moved with reverence, as though he understood there were stories in the walls that had nothing to do with theology. I was tasked with hosting him, guiding him through his stay, ensuring he had everything he needed. I served tea, arranged the reading room, prepared the manuscripts he requested, walked him to and from meetings with my father. On the surface, it was routine. But something in Samir's presence unsettled me, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made me feel seen in a manner I could not easily dismiss. On the third night of his stay, after most of the compound fell silent, I found him sitting in the dimly lit common room. He was reading, the warm glow of a brass lamp illuminating the soft lines on his face. I intended only to greet him and retreat to my own quarters, but the moment he lifted his eyes to me, it was as though he understood exactly why I had stopped walking. "You look exhausted," he said, not with judgment, but with concern. "Not the kind that sleep can fix." I froze. No one spoke to me that way, no one dared. He closed his book and leaned forward slightly, studying me with a depth that made my pulse shift. "Forgive me if this is too bold," he said quietly, "but you look like a man carrying a well that has gone dry." Something inside me trembled. I sat down without intending to, my body responding before my mind could protest. The words pressed against my chest, threatening to break through the shell I had spent years fortifying. I tried to deny it, to brush it off with a polite smile. But the truth slipped out instead, fragile, unpolished. What if the well was never full to begin with? Samir didn't look shocked, he didn't recoil. He simply nodded, as though he had been waiting for that confession. And for the first time in my life, I felt the faintest shift, like the first breeze before a storm that brings not destruction, but cleansing. What began as a hesitant confession opened into hours of conversation. The night stretched on around us, the guest house settling into its familiar silence while I spoke with an honesty I had never allowed myself before. I told Samir about the emptiness I couldn't explain, the pressure that suffocated me, the panic that clawed at my chest during prayers. I admitted that for years I had felt disconnected from the very faith I was expected to uphold, that my devotion had become an elaborate performance I no longer knew how to inhabit. Samir didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fill the silence with answers. He listened the way a physician might listen to a patient describing symptoms of an illness long ignored, carefully, respectfully, without flinching at the depth of the wound. When I finally fell silent, drained and ashamed, he folded his hands in his lap and spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Yusuf," he said, "sometimes a man can be surrounded by water his entire life and still die of thirst." His eyes softened, not because the water wasn't there, but because he was never shown how to drink. The words settled over me like a blanket, both comforting and unsettling. I felt exposed, as though he had reached inside and named something I didn't know how to articulate. A part of me wanted to retreat, to rebuild the walls I had worked so hard to maintain. But another part, the desperate, silent part, leaned toward him, searching. He reached into his briefcase then, slowly, deliberately, as though handling something fragile. When he withdrew his hand, he was holding a small book bound in worn brown leather, plain, unmarked. Its very simplicity seemed out of place amid the ornamented architecture of the guest house. He placed it gently on the table between us. "This," he said quietly, "is the Injil, the New Testament, in Arabic." My breath caught. I stared at the book as though it were a burning coal. I knew the risk of simply looking at it, let alone touching it. My mind surged with warnings, with doctrine, with fear drilled into me since childhood. "I'm not asking you to believe it," Samir said, reading the terror in my eyes. "I'm not even asking you to agree with it. I'm asking you to read it honestly, not to debate it, not to refute it, but to simply let it speak." He nudged the book slightly toward me. "If the well inside you is dry, perhaps it is time to look beyond the walls that have confined your soul." My fingers hovered above the cover. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. But something in me shifted, the faintest flicker of curiosity piercing through fear. Before leaving, Samir said one last thing. "The truth does not fear being examined. Only lies do." When he finally retired to his room, the common area felt heavier, charged with an invisible tension. I stared at the book for a long time, my mind battling my heart, my upbringing wrestling with my despair. In the end, I didn't take it to my room. I hid it behind a loose wooden panel near the stairwell, a hiding place I had discovered years earlier. I told myself it was only temporary, that I would return it to him before he left, but deep down I knew the truth. I would come back for it. For 2 weeks after Samir's departure, I avoided the hidden panel on the second-floor landing. I avoided even walking near it. I convinced myself that the tremor in my chest whenever I thought of the book was nothing more than fear of betraying my upbringing, of crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Yet each night, as I wandered the guest house in its familiar lonely silence, my steps drifted a little closer to the spot where I had hidden the New Testament. The emptiness inside me had become unbearable, a slow ache that hollowed me out from within. On the night of October 14th, at 2:37 in the morning, the exact time burned into my memory as though marked with fire, I finally reached for the panel. My hands trembled. Not from the danger, though it was great, but from the weight of something I couldn't name. When I slid the book out from the wall, dust clung to the leather, and for a moment I simply stared at it, feeling as though I held something forbidden yet inexplicably alive. I didn't even choose a place to sit. I opened it right there in the dim corridor, beneath the soft hum of a flickering lamp. The pages parted somewhere in the Gospel of Matthew, and my eyes landed on words that pierced so deeply I felt the breath leave my body. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The words repeated in my mind, rest, 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 as though someone was speaking them aloud. My hands shook harder. I blinked, unable to tear my gaze away. Rest for your soul. I had never experienced rest, not in childhood, not in prayer, not in decades of religious perfection. Everything I had ever done was driven by duty, performance, fear of disappointing my father, fear of failing the legacy. But rest? A soul at rest? It was a concept as foreign to me as the stars beyond the desert sky. I sank to the floor, the cool marble steady against my back, and kept reading. The hours passed unnoticed as I moved from Matthew to Mark, then Luke, then John. The stories did not feel like myths or mere teachings. They felt alive, imbued with a tenderness I had never encountered. This Jesus did not demand perfection. He did not measure devotion by performance. He touched lepers, embraced outcasts, wept with the grieving, forgave those drowning in shame. He spoke not with the tone of a judge, but with the voice of a shepherd seeking the lost. By the time the first hint of dawn slipped into the hallway, something deep inside me had shifted. A trembling certainty that everything I thought I knew about God was incomplete. But the true turning point came 3 months later. It was a cold January night. The guest house was empty, the compound asleep. I had spent the evening reading the Gospel of John, my heart restless, my mind torn between fear and longing. Near 3 in the morning, drawn by an impulse I couldn't resist, I entered the small prayer room on the 2nd floor, the same room where countless scholars had prayed for guidance, victory, clarity. I knelt on the carpet. I didn't recite anything memorized. I didn't follow any ritual. I simply whispered, "Jesus, if you are who you say you are, I need you." What happened next is something I will never be able to fully explain with human language. The air shifted. Not dramatically, not like thunder or wind, but gently, like a warmth spreading from an unseen source. The shadows softened, the silence deepened into something alive. My heartbeat slowed, my breath steadied, and a presence, real, unmistakable, filled the room. It wasn't a vision, it wasn't imagination. It was a person, a light, not harsh or blinding, but soft as dawn, seemed to settle around me, and in the middle of that light, I heard a voice, not with my ears, but with the deepest part of my being. "Yusuf, you are my beloved. You were never meant to be a vessel of fear." Every weight I had carried for decades broke, not eased, broke, fell away as though chains had been shattered by invisible hands. I collapsed forward, not in terror, but in release, overwhelmed by a love so fierce and gentle that it remade the shape of my soul. I had spent my life searching for God in rules and rituals, but that night, God came to me in the form of a Savior who knew my name, and I surrendered. In the months that followed my surrender to Jesus, the guest house transformed from a monument of inherited tradition into the birthplace of a new, fragile, and dangerous faith. I lived 2 lives, one hidden, one demanded. By day, I was still the eldest son of Sheikh Mahmud al-Hadia, the dutiful scholar, the perfect heir to a legacy I no longer belonged to. But by night, in the quiet corners of the guest house, I opened a world that had been sealed to me my entire life. The transformation began unexpectedly with a young man named Karim Sakir. Karim arrived at the compound for religious counseling, sent by his father, a wealthy merchant deeply concerned about his son's growing disillusionment. From the moment he stepped into the guest house, I recognized something familiar in his eyes, the same hunger that had once haunted my own reflection, the silent pleading of a soul exhausted from pretending to possess answers it never found. Our first conversation was polite and predictable. Our second was hesitant but honest. By the third, he could no longer hold back. His voice cracked as he confessed a truth he had been terrified to say aloud. "I pray," he said, "but the words feel empty. I study, but nothing reaches my heart. I feel like I'm dying inside." The vulnerability in his voice pierced me. It was the same confession I had once whispered to the walls of this very building. I felt the gravity of the moment, felt the weight of a choice that could alter both our lives. So I told him my story. Not everything, not at once, but the truth where it mattered, about the emptiness, the doubts, the night of collapse. The words of Jesus that had shattered the silence inside me. He didn't recoil, he didn't argue, he listened the same way Samir had listened to me. And when I finished, Karim said, barely above a whisper, "Can I read what you read?" There was no hesitation in me anymore. That night, in the small prayer room upstairs, beneath the soft flicker of the lantern light, I handed him the New Testament that had changed my life. His hands trembled as he received it, gentle, reverent, afraid, hopeful. 3 days later, he returned with tears streaming down his face. "Yusuf," he said, "I met him. I don't know how to explain it. But I met him. I prayed with him as he surrendered his life to Jesus, his voice breaking with relief. When he rose from the carpet, the haunted look that had once clouded his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady light. I didn't realize it then, but Kareem would become the first stone in a foundation God himself was building, an underground church hidden in the very heart of one of Saudi Arabia's most respected religious families, and it had only just begun. Kareem's transformation spread through the guest house like a quiet flame, gentle, controlled, but impossible to extinguish. I had not intended to guide anyone else. I told myself Kareem was an exception, a soul God had placed before me in a moment of divine timing. But the guest house had always been a place where people came seeking answers, and now I carried a truth powerful enough to resurrect a dying heart. It was only a matter of time before another soul found their way into the light. Her name was Layla Bahri. Layla was a literature professor, brilliant and composed, with a reputation for intellectual rigor. Yet when she walked into the guest house, she carried a grief so heavy it seemed to bend the air around her. Her younger brother, Sami, had died by suicide 3 months earlier. No one in her family knew how to speak of it without shame. No one in her community offered comfort, only warnings, lectures, and whispered blame. My father spoke to her briefly, offering formal condolences before assigning her ongoing counsel to me. He believed I could ease her academic questions about destiny and suffering. But what she carried wasn't an intellectual crisis. It was a wound that had rotted in silence. During our first meeting, she barely spoke. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on a point that did not exist. By the second meeting, the dam broke. Her voice trembled as she spoke of Sami, his laughter, his battles with depression the night she found him. She questioned everything she had been taught about divine mercy, about the meaning of life and death, about a God who seemed distant when she cried out for help. "What kind of God?" she whispered through tears. "Lets someone suffer so deeply and then punishes the family for the grief that follows?" I knew that question. I had asked it myself in different words. So I told her about Jesus, carefully, gently, not as an argument, but as a story. I told her about the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. I told her how he cried at the tomb of Lazarus, even though he knew resurrection was moments away. I told her of a Savior who did not shame the broken, who did not condemn the grieving, who entered suffering with compassion instead of judgment. Every word seemed to loosen something in her chest. On our fourth meeting, Layla asked if she could read the New Testament for herself. I gave her a copy, the same way I had given one to Kareem. The following night, she returned with swollen eyes and a trembling resolve. "He was with Sami," she said softly. "I don't know how I know, but he was with him, and he's with me." That night, she knelt on the common room floor, right beneath the same chandelier that had illuminated decades of scholarly debates, and gave her life to Jesus with a whisper full of hope and pain interwoven. 2 souls now, 2 lives transformed. And the guest house, once a sanctuary of academic discourse, was slowly becoming something far more sacred. Layla's transformation marked a turning point. It was as if the guest house itself sensed its shifting purpose. The walls that had once echoed with theological debates now held whispered prayers. The rooms that had housed visiting scholars now sheltered souls rediscovering hope. And though I never advertised what was happening, the broken, the weary, and the questioning somehow found their way to me, one by one, each carrying a story only God could have orchestrated. The next was Farid Munif. Farid arrived without ceremony, a man in his early 50s, shoulders broad, expression hardened by years of military service. Unlike Kareem or Layla, he didn't come seeking answers. He came because he could no longer bear the weight of the answers he already had. His nights were filled with memories he refused to describe, shadows he could not escape. He believed his sins were too great for forgiveness, that no prayer could cleanse the blood on his hands. He sat across from me in the common room, unmoving, unblinking, his voice flat as stone. "Some men," he said, "are born beyond redemption. I am one of them. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I simply told him the story of a man named Saul, who hunted believers, who imprisoned them, who watched them die, a man who encountered Jesus on a dusty road and became Paul, the apostle who carried the gospel to the nations he once persecuted. Fareed's lips trembled. His eyes, lifeless moments earlier, flickered with something almost like disbelief. For the first time he asked, forgiveness, not from me, but from God. And in that small prayer room, beneath the quiet glow of a single lantern, a man who believed he was beyond saving broke into sobs so deep and raw that I felt the ground beneath us shift. When he finally surrendered his life to Jesus, the hardness in his face melted away, replaced by a peace I knew he had chased for decades. And still God wasn't done. Omar and Selma Rafiq arrived together, a married couple who had been quietly questioning Islam for nearly 10 years. Their doubts had grown in silence, shaped by late-night conversations they could never share outside their home. They came to the guest house under the pretense of seeking marital guidance, but once the doors closed behind them, they confessed everything. Their longing, their confusion, their fear, their hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to God than what they had been taught. I shared the gospel with them. They listened with fingers intertwined, tears forming as they heard the story of a God who loved them before they could earn it, who saw them before they could prove themselves, who offered grace without conditions. They asked to pray together, and in that prayer room, hand in hand, they surrendered to Jesus. When they rose from the floor, it felt as though the air itself shimmered with joy. 1 became 2, 2 became 3, 3 became 8, and soon there were dozens. By late 2022, 19 people had come to know Jesus inside the Al-Hadir guest house, 19 souls who had walked into the compound burdened by grief, fear, or emptiness, and walked out carrying a hope they had never known. But as their numbers grew, another truth became painfully clear. Faith cannot survive in isolation. These new believers needed one another. They needed worship, teaching, community, prayer. They needed something more than whispered conversations in private corners. They needed a church. And so, in January 2023, I made the most dangerous decision of my life. I organized the first secret gathering. 7 people meeting at midnight in the common room, each arrival staggered by 15 minutes, each one slipping in through a back entrance shielded by tall hedges and years of neglect. We sang quietly, barely above a whisper. We read scripture by lamplight. We prayed with cautious joy. The fear was real, but so was the presence. Thursday after Thursday, the gathering grew. 12 people, 18, 23, 34, and by December, 47 believers filled the room, 47 hearts beating in unison, 47 miracles standing shoulder to shoulder, 47 flames of faith burning in the least likely place imaginable. But secrets, especially holy ones, are fragile, and it was only a matter of time before ours was discovered. I live now in a place I never imagined, an anonymous apartment on the 4th floor of an old building somewhere in Europe, far from the desert winds of my homeland, far from the echoing halls of the Al-Hadir compound, far from the expectations that once shaped every breath I took. My life is simple, almost painfully ordinary. I wake up early. I go to work. I return home to a space small enough that the walls feel close when I pray. I own nothing of value, no heirlooms, no titles, no property, no inheritance, and yet, for the first time in 40 years, I am free. Sometimes I sit by the window at night, watching the distant glow of city lights flicker in the rain. I think of the life I lost, not with bitterness, but with a strange mixture of mourning and gratitude. My father, Sheikh Mahmoud, has not spoken my name since the night he declared me dead. Amina, my wife, never reached out. I do not know how my children are being raised or what they have been told about me. There are moments when the ache of that loss settles heavily in my chest, a reminder that faith often demands a cost we cannot predict. But then I think of the 47 men and women whose lives were touched by the same Savior who found me in the silence of the guest house. 47 souls who discovered hope where there had once been only fear. Today they are scattered across the world: Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Canada, Karim Sakir, once a young man drowning in doubt, now leads a small house fellowship for Middle Eastern refugees in Berlin. Leila Bahri is studying theology in Amsterdam, determined to help other women heal from grief and spiritual isolation. Farid Munif volunteers at a refugee center in Stockholm, listening to the broken with a gentleness I never thought possible for him. Omar and Selma Rafiq recently welcomed a child, a daughter they named Hannah, meaning grace. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I had stayed silent, if I had clung to the safety of reputation, inheritance, and obedience, if I had chosen fear over truth. Those 47 lives might never have encountered the love that changed everything for me. And I ask myself a question. I now ask you, what is your guest house? Not a literal building. A space in your life where your voice carries weight. A place where someone is waiting, perhaps silently, desperately, for hope. Maybe it's your workplace. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's a friend who has been searching for something they cannot describe. Maybe it's a stranger God will place in your path when you least expect it. You don't need a grand platform. You don't need perfect knowledge. You don't need to be fearless. You only need to be willing. I lost everything the world told me mattered, my status, my family name, my inheritance. But I gained Christ, and in Him I found a peace I had spent my entire life chasing in rituals, performances, and expectations that never touched my soul. If my story has reached you, if somewhere in these words you felt a stirring, a question, a whisper, don't ignore it. Let it speak. Let it lead you. And if this testimony touched your heart, I invite you to share where you're watching from so we can pray for you. Like this video so others can find it. And subscribe for more testimonies of lives transformed by the one who sees, who knows, and who saves. Because the truth is simple. Jesus found me in the darkest place I knew, and He can find you too.